This is a very special program because we are going to be sharing our heart with you today. And I just want to say right at the front, sweetheart, that you and I are strong, and I think that our marriage is better today.
For 30 years, she smiled into cameras that reached billions of homes. She preached about truth and family and the protection of the innocent. She built one of the most powerful Christian media empires in the history of the genre, and she did it with what appeared to the outside world to be unwavering faith, unshakable conviction, and a genuinely warm heart. But behind every broadcast, behind every perfectly lit studio, and every carefully constructed on-air moment, there was a life that those cameras never captured. A life full of decisions that contradicted everything the cameras showed. And today, with Joni Lamb now gone, she died on May 7th, 2026, at 65 years old, we are going to tell you the full story. Not the version Daystar produced for broadcast, the version the record actually shows. Before we go any further, everything you are about to hear is drawn from verified, publicly documented sources, including NPR, NBC, DFW, The Christian Post, The Dallas Observer, court filings, ABC News, The Roy's Report, The Trinity Foundation, and Wikipedia. Where we describe allegations, we will tell you they are allegations. Where we describe documented facts, we will tell you they are documented. This is not an obituary that flatters, and it is not an attack that distorts. It is the full picture. Because the full picture matters, especially when the institution being discussed reaches into over 2 billion homes around the world and continues to solicit the financial support of millions of viewers in the name of God. Joni Lamb was born Joni Trammell on July 19, 1960, in Colleyville, Texas. She grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, in a deeply devout family who attended Tremont Avenue Church of God, a congregation where faith was not something performed on Sunday mornings and set aside the rest of the week. It was the lens through which every day was understood, and it was inside those church walls that the whole trajectory of her life was first shaped. A young evangelist from Georgia came to lead a revival. His name was Marcus Lamb. He was 20 years old, confident at the pulpit, and carried the kind of presence that fills a room before a word is spoken. Joni noticed. Marcus noticed. They began talking after the service, and then kept talking through the weeks and months that followed. They married on August 6, 1982. She was 21. He was 20. In the early years of their marriage, they were simply traveling evangelists. No platform, no network, no empire. Just two young people driving across the country, preaching wherever a church would have them, frequently struggling to pay for the road they were on. Then, less than a year into their marriage, Marcus described a moment in Israel that he would talk about for the rest of his life. He said God spoke to him directly and told him to build a television station. They believed it. They committed to it. And by some accounts, the startup costs were so lean that Marcus pulled a broadcast transmitter out of a literal dumpster just to get the signal on the air. In 1985, that salvaged transmitter became WMCF-TV 45, broadcasting out of Montgomery, Alabama, and nicknamed 45 Alive. Marcus was 27. Joni was 24. It was the first Christian television station in the entire state of Alabama. Their son Jonathan was born around that time. Daughter Rachel followed in 1990. That same year, the Lambs sold WMCF-TV to the Trinity Broadcasting Network and moved to Dallas, Texas, where they acquired a defunct local channel and started over. Their first live broadcast featured T.D. Jakes' New Year's service at the Potter's House in 1992. Their third and youngest child, Rebecca, was born that same year. Then on New Year's Day, 1998, they made everything official. The Daystar Television Network launched formally under a name drawn from 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 19, a verse about a day star rising in believers' hearts. It was not branding. It was a mission statement written in Scripture. And in those early years, by all visible evidence, they meant it. What followed was extraordinary by any measure. By 2003, Daystar had moved into a 90,000 square foot facility with 17 advanced broadcast studios. The programming lineup grew to include some of the biggest names in American Christianity: Joel Osteen, Joyce Meyer, Jesse Duplantis, and Hillsong Church. Marcus leveraged his deep connection to Israel to secure a broadcast license there in 2006, making Daystar the first Christian network of its kind to broadcast in the country. The network spread across major cable and satellite providers globally, eventually reaching into more than 200 countries and claiming an audience of over 2 billion homes. By any outward measure, it was the fulfillment of everything that salvaged transmitter had once promised. But even in the middle of that extraordinary ascent, the cracks were forming in the foundation, and some of the earliest cracks were financial. In April 2014, NPR published a landmark investigation into Daystar's finances, drawing on 6 years of audited financial statements obtained through court records filed as part of a 2011 employee lawsuit. The investigation found that in a 2009 sermon delivered in Australia, Marcus Lamb had told his audience that in the previous 5 years, Daystar had written $30 million in charitable donation checks. NPR examined the financial records and found $9.7 million in actual charitable contributions to outside recipients, roughly 5% of total donor revenue. Not 30 million, approximately 9.7. The same investigation found that Daystar had spent $572,000 in ministry funds sponsoring a Christian NASCAR driver named Blake Koch. NPR was precise in its reporting that this came from non-donation ministry income rather than from viewer contributions directly, a distinction Daystar itself would emphasize. The network had extended a $2.3 million loan to the Reverend Frank Harbour, Marcus Lamb's former special assistant and self-described golfing buddy, to help him start a church. That loan subsequently defaulted, and it had spent nearly $100,000 purchasing bulk copies of Joni's own autobiography, Surrender All, from retail bookstores, a tactic that can drive up bestseller list placement. Daystar stated that those books were given away to donors as gifts. None of these expenditures were illegal. Daystar responded to NPR by stating that all of its practices complied with IRS rules and that all charitable contributions went to groups sharing its Christian mission. The network also pointed out, accurately, that it was audited annually by an outside accounting firm. The deeper structural problem was not law-breaking, it was opacity, because the IRS had classified Daystar as a church rather than a standard charitable organization. The network was entirely exempt from filing the public financial disclosures that most nonprofits must submit. The 990 Form I, the document that allows any member of the public to examine a charity's income, expenditures, executive compensation, and governance, did not apply to Daystar. Viewers who gave an annual average of $35 million to the network had no legally mandated mechanism for knowing how those funds were used. They had only what Daystar chose to tell them. Former executive assistant Lisa Anderson, who worked for Joni from 2007 to 2011, later told NPR that the gap between the on-air version of Daystar and the reality of working there was significant. She said that when the cameras were on, it felt like a ministry. When the cameras were off, she said, it felt like a business making money. She was on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including holidays. She described one Thanksgiving where Joni called and asked her to drive to a bakery, pick up a cake, and deliver it to the Lamb home. She drove to the house, walked past the family at their own Thanksgiving table, set the cake on the counter, and drove back to her interrupted dinner without a single word spoken to her. Then came 2010, and the story that changed everything, at least publicly. Marcus Lamb sat before his own cameras and confessed to a marital affair. He and Joni framed it as an act of transparency and courage, saying they were going public because they were victims of a blackmail attempt. 3 individuals, they said, were demanding $7.5 million to stay silent, and Marcus and Joni refused to pay blackmailers with God's money. Joni spoke through tears about betrayal and forgiveness. The couple then appeared on the Dr. Phil program to reinforce the narrative of faith triumphing over temptation. It was one of the most effective pieces of crisis communication Christian television had ever produced. But the documented reality behind that public confession was considerably more complicated. The supposed blackmailers were not criminals demanding money in a back alley. They were 3 former Daystar employees who had filed civil lawsuits. The affair itself, according to reporting by NBC DFW and the Dallas Observer, and according to lawsuit documents filed in Dallas County District Court in December 2010, was not a brief moral failing. It was a 7-year relationship with a senior Daystar executive named Janice Smith. CBS News reported that the lawsuit contained an email Marcus had written to Smith, in which he stated plainly that he could not wait to make her the next Mrs. Marcus Lamb. The lawsuit further alleged that upon Smith's departure from Daystar, she was paid significant sums and that donor funds had been used in connection with the affair. Those allegations were contested by Daystar. Marcus and Joni called the women filing those lawsuits extortionists and labeled them publicly in front of their audience. The Bedford Police Department investigated the extortion claim and dropped it, finding insufficient evidence to proceed. The lawsuits were eventually settled and dismissed. Their audience forgave them. The network went on. Only months later, a second lawsuit arrived. Jennifer Falcon filed suit in federal court in Dallas, alleging that Bill Trammell, Joni Lamb's own father, who held a position at Daystar as administrative manager of special projects, had created a hostile work environment through repeated sexual harassment. The suit alleged that Trammell had required Falcon to hug him tightly for extended periods during what he called quiet time, had positioned his hands inappropriately during those interactions, and on multiple occasions had told her to sit on his lap. Falcon had viewed him as a father figure. Marcus and Joni denied the allegations. That lawsuit was eventually dismissed. The network went on. Dismissed lawsuits do not mean the allegations were false. They mean the cases did not proceed to a verdict. The women's accounts are part of the documented record, regardless of the legal outcome. And they belong in this story because they form part of a pattern of allegations met by institutional denial, legal maneuvering, and public reframing that would repeat itself at Daystar over the following 15 years. By 2017, Jonathan Lamb had risen to become Daystar's vice president. He and his wife Suzy co-hosted a show called The Green Room. Marcus and Joni were publicly proud, but behind that picture, something was already breaking. In 2017, Suzy went in for a chiropractic adjustment at Daystar's in-house facility. The chiropractor performing the adjustment was a man Marcus and Joni had personally brought into the building, believing he had reformed his life following a prior incident in which he had allegedly assaulted a minor and subsequently lost his chiropractic license. Joni was sufficiently aware of his history that a policy existed requiring a second person to be present during any adjustment involving a woman. But on this particular occasion, Suzy's co-worker stepped out briefly. In the minutes, Suzy was alone with the chiropractor. She says he violently sexually assaulted her. She called Jonathan immediately. Jonathan called his parents. According to Jonathan and Suzy's account, documented in detail by the Roy's report, Marcus told Jonathan over the phone to say nothing and that he would handle it. Several days later, Joni told Suzy that Marcus had paid the chiropractor off, that he would not harm her again, and then said these words, "We need to protect Daystar, and I want to protect you, so don't say a word about this to anyone." Daystar, in a formal statement to the Roy's report, denied that Marcus paid off the chiropractor and denied that Joni ever told Suzy not to speak. The chiropractor passed away in 2021 without ever having been charged. No police report was filed in 2017. And Suzy Lamb carried that assault in silence, inside the building that had silenced her, for years before she spoke about it publicly. Now we move to 2020. COVID-19 reshapes the world, and Daystar uses its extraordinary platform to push back against vaccines and promote alternative treatments. In July of 2020, Daystar received a $3.9 million federal Paycheck Protection Program loan. Weeks later, according to Ministry Watch's investigative reporting, the network purchased a 1997 Gulfstream GV private jet. When Inside Edition asked Marcus Lamb about the timing, he said the jet was purchased using proceeds from an investment and the sale of the network's old aircraft, not PPP funds. Daystar subsequently returned the entire $3.9 million loan with interest following Inside Edition's coverage. During that same summer of 2020, the darkest thread in this entire story surfaced. Suzy Lamb later told the Roy's report that a male family member referred to in all subsequent coverage as Pete told her during a family gathering that their 4-year-old daughter had accidentally walked in on him in the bathroom while he was undressed. Suzy found it strange but initially attributed it to coincidence. By November 2020, the child was able to disclose to her mother that she had been sexually assaulted by a man. The child could not name the perpetrator by name but provided physical descriptions. Suzy contacted the child's school and confirmed no male employee had access to her there. Jonathan and Suzy reported the disclosure to Colleyville police, but because the child would not speak to detectives, the case was closed. Suzy also called Joni. Joni's response was not to call the police. Instead, she reportedly urged Suzy to bring the girl to her and took the child alone into a private room. After that meeting, the child stopped talking about the incident entirely, a development that deeply troubled Suzy when she reflected on it years later in light of what had happened to her in 2017. Joni Lamb denied to the Roy's report that she had ever discussed the abuse with her granddaughter one-on-one. 8 months later, in August 2021, the extended Lamb family vacationed together at a rented beach house in Miramar Beach, Florida. Jonathan and Suzy's daughter, now 5 years old, asked to go swimming. Suzy told her to go upstairs and change into her bathing suit. Pete, who was present, immediately stood up and followed the child toward the stairs. Suzy described watching his demeanor change. His expression shifted in a way she found alarming. She immediately went to get Jonathan, deliberately choosing to send her husband rather than going herself, because she understood that a mother's alarm would be more easily dismissed than a father's account. Jonathan went upstairs and found Pete in the bedroom with their daughter, who was completely undressed. Pete began apologizing immediately and repeatedly. Jonathan later described it to the Roy's report as walking in on someone who had been caught red-handed, someone who said he was sorry approximately 50 times. Both couples were brought together. Marcus and Joni's response was to defend Pete, suggesting his presence upstairs was simply because he adored the child and wanted to spend time with her. When Suzy pointed out that none of that explained why a grown man was in a bedroom with a naked 5-year-old, Joni's response, according to Suzy's documented account, was to suggest the child had simply undressed herself. Marcus reportedly told the group he understood what it felt like to be falsely accused. The two couples were then instructed to repent to one another and pray together. Jonathan and Suzy were asked to apologize to Pete. 1 week later, Marcus called Jonathan into his office and told him that Pete had been forensically cleared by counselor Debbie Leonhardt, who had been brought in to assess the situation. That statement was not accurate. Leonhardt later told the Roy's report she had never completed the assessment of Pete because his wife had been present for the intended interview and answered all questions on his behalf, making an independent evaluation impossible. She said she had told the family Pete would need to return for a proper interview. He never did. Jonathan and Suzy did not learn until November 2023 through a recorded conversation with Denise Boggs, the trusted family advisor who had arranged the Leonhardt sessions, that the clearance Marcus had cited had never actually been issued. 3 months after the conversation, where Marcus cited that clearance, on November 30th, 2021, Marcus Lamb died from complications of COVID-19 at 64 years old. He had publicly discouraged his viewers from receiving COVID vaccines throughout the year preceding his death. Jonathan and Suzy never got the opportunity to confront Marcus about what he had told them. That conversation will never happen now. After Marcus died, Joni began a relationship with Doug Weiss, a Christian counselor and recurring Daystar guest who had appeared on the network with his wife, Lisa, in 2019, describing her publicly as the person with the purest heart he had ever met. Doug filed for divorce from Lisa just 58 days after Marcus passed away. All 3 of Joni's children objected to the developing relationship. A trusted advisor put a written warning about Weiss into Joni's hands. Doug's own wife reportedly sought to save the marriage. None of it altered Joni's course. She married Doug Weiss on June 10, 2023. According to multiple accounts, none of her children attended the wedding. What followed from that marriage is extensively documented. A 90-minute recorded meeting in which Pastor Jimmy Evans told Jonathan Lamb that his mother was the voice of God to him at Daystar, and that his role was to obey her. Suzy being fired for refusing to read a viewer comment endorsing the marriage on air. Jonathan being stripped of his vice presidency, placed on a formal performance improvement plan, and subjected to a GPS tracking device placed in his company vehicle by the network's own head of security, a fact documented in expense records obtained by the Roy's report. Daystar's own attorney telling Jonathan on tape that challenging the authority of your organization is not something you have the right to do. Jonathan terminated on November 16, 2024, in a dismissal letter delivered by a security guard who arrived at the Lamb home carrying a firearm and wearing a bulletproof vest. More than 30 major programming partners, including Joyce Meyer, Greg Laurie, and Jack Hibbs, left the network in 2024 and 2025 amid the accumulating scandal. The family, once held up as the living embodiment of Christian family values on Christian television, was fractured publicly and completely. Joni Lamb's health had been declining through the early months of 2026. She had been battling metastatic bone cancer, a diagnosis that had never been disclosed publicly while she was alive. In the weeks before her death, she made one documented private attempt at restoration. According to a close family friend whose account was corroborated by Jonathan and Suzy Lamb in an interview with the Roy's report, Joni met privately with board member Tom Callender approximately 3 weeks before she died. She had her makeup applied. She sat upright in her makeup chair through 30 minutes of conversation despite the pain. And in that meeting, she told Callender, if Jonathan tries to reach out, give him back Daystar. Those words came after years of conflict. They came after the firings, the surveillance, the NDA demand, and the GPS tracker. They came from a woman who, by the account of those who knew her well, knew she was dying and knew that her house was not in order. Jonathan was not at her side when she died. He was not called to the hospital. He was not warned that her condition was critical. He learned that his mother had passed away approximately 10 minutes before Daystar made the announcement on social media. He was told by a corporate attorney, not by his family. She died on May 7th, 2026, at 65 years old. Now here is the thing about Joni Lamb that makes this story more complicated than a simple morality tale, and it deserves to be said plainly. She started with nothing. She and Marcus pulled a transmitter out of a dumpster and turned it into a network that genuinely reached billions of people across more than 200 countries. Millions of people heard the gospel through that platform who might never have encountered it otherwise. Missionaries were supported, communities were served, lives were changed in ways that cannot be measured or dismissed. That is real. It carries genuine weight, and it should not be set aside, not even in the middle of everything else we have just described. But the same values Joni broadcast for 30 years, the sanctity of family, the protection of the vulnerable, the necessity of truth, the accountability of those in positions of spiritual authority, were the values that collapsed most visibly and most painfully in her own home. She told her audience for 3 decades to stand in truth, and she silenced a daughter-in-law who had been assaulted in the building she ran. She told her audience to protect the innocent, and when a 5-year-old child was allegedly found in a room with a man who had already raised serious concerns, her documented institutional response was to protect the organization and ask the child's parents to apologize. She told her audience that faith required transparency, and she ran a network that operated without financial disclosure under a church exemption, whose founding patriarch had conducted a 7-year affair, and whose ministry resources had been used in ways that a full NPR investigation found did not match what was being told to viewers. These are not contradictions that belong only to Joni Lamb. They are the contradictions that emerge from building a public identity entirely around broadcast perfection and never leaving room for the kind of honest, accountable, human failure that Scripture itself makes space for. The camera was always on, the image was always managed, and the story beneath the image kept growing in the dark until it had nowhere left to go. Marcus Lamb died in November of 2021 and left a succession plan in writing that named Jonathan. Joni Lamb died in May of 2026 and reportedly left a private wish with her most trusted board member that also named Jonathan. Both parents, in the end, according to the documented record, pointed in the same direction. Whether the people currently running Daystar choose to honor that remains, as of this broadcast, entirely unresolved. Jonathan Lamb has said publicly that he remains ready to serve, that this was never about ambition or a title, that it is about faithfulness to a calling both his parents recognized. He said it without bitterness, under a childhood photograph of himself with his mother. In 9 words, "Thank you for your prayers. God will carry us through." That is the son Joni Lamb raised. And somewhere in the final weeks of her life, sitting up in a makeup chair in pain, talking privately to the man who had served at her side for decades, it appears she remembered that too. A television screen only ever shows you what the producer decides you are allowed to see. For 30 years, Joni Lamb was a gifted and disciplined producer. The rest of the story, the fuller, more human, more painful, and more complicated story was always there. It just had to wait for the cameras to turn off. If this video has given you something to think about, something to feel, or something to pray over, we would deeply appreciate you sharing it with someone who has been following the Daystar story. Leave a comment telling us what part of this full story you believe deserves the most honest accounting going forward. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you are with us when new verified information becomes available. The questions of governance, succession, transparency, and accountability at Daystar Television Network are still unanswered. We will keep asking them. We will see you in the next one. God bless you.